Hi, it's Tom here, and before we get into this episode of Last Orders, I just want to tell you about a very special film that Spiked has out this month called Black Guns Matter. It's all about a guy called Madge Ture. He's a Second Amendment activist in inner city Philadelphia, and it's all about his fight against what he sees as the racist policies of gun control. You can watch it on YouTube, you can watch it on Spiked as well. It really is a must watch, so please do check it out. Now, on with the show. Welcome to Last Orders, the Spiked podcast on all things nanny state. I'm Tom Slater, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and this is the show where myself and Chris Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs discuss the latest in public health killjoyism, all with the help of an invited guest. In this episode, we're joined by the IEA's Kate Andrews to discuss plain packaging for food, Rory Stewart smoking opium, the demise of Jamie Oliver, and much more. Hello and welcome to Last Orders, the Spike podcast on all things nanny state. I'm Tom Slater, and today, as ever, I'm joined by the IEA's Director of Lifestyle Economics, Chris Snowdon. Hello, Chris. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm very well, thanks, Tom.
Great. And today we're delighted to be joined also from the IEA by Associate Director and familiar to many people as a regular commentator on TV and radio, Kate Andrews. Hello, Kate.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No problem. So to kick things off, let's talk about the Nanny State Index. This is something that came out recently. It's a Chris Snowdon brainchild published by the IEA, which researches and ranks EU countries on their nanny state policies and has been running since 2016. So it's kind of a league table, I guess, the best and the worst countries in which to eat, drink, smoke and vape. And so this year's results are out and they paint a bit of a depressing picture, particularly if you live in Finland, but also which has come number one for the worst nannying country in this league table, but also the UK not too far away in fourth place. So Chris, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what the Nanny State Index found this year? What are the trends, what's happening in Europe?
Trends are nearly all negative from my point of view. Things are generally getting worse all over the place. Some places are getting worse more quickly than others. The standout countries in a way are Latvia and Lithuania, where they brought in loads of pretty mad temperance legislation. There's more and more countries also banning the use of e-cigarettes indoors and putting taxes on e-cigarettes. And partly for that reason, the UK has actually slipped down slightly. So it was second last time, and it's fourth this time, as you rightly say. Finland is number one, probably always will be. Unless we introduce some other countries. I've just come back from Iceland, and I reckon Iceland could probably nick the number one spot if we included it. So I'm thinking about including Norway, Iceland, and Switzerland next time. Start getting some non-EU countries in, because hopefully Britain will not be an EU country by then. But Iceland I was kind of talking to people in Iceland about Lithuania and saying, man, you wouldn't believe what they've done over there. They've just raised the drinking age to 20. And I go like, yeah, we've had that for a long time. And the alcohol taxes are really high. It's like, yeah, you want to see ours. And they've got Finland's got a state monopoly for off licenses. Yeah, got that. So there's not much I could throw at them that they weren't very familiar with. It doesn't stop them binge drinking, as I have to say, in my experience. So yeah, I mean, it's a downward spiral. There's one or two countries where things have got slightly better, but usually almost by accident. So Greece repealed its wine tax, for example, which it only brought in a couple of years ago for the first time in its long history. But that was just some legal technicality. Basically, things are getting worse. Things are getting worse in the UK, and you shouldn't let the fact that it's slipped. We've slipped from second to fourth make you think in any way that we become more liberal. We haven't. It's just a couple of countries have got even worse.
Very rosy picture. Kate, was there anything in the rankings this year that kind of struck you?
Well, as Chris says, the UK lost what is essentially a rusty crown. You don't want to be the winner in the Nanny State Index, not because the UK improved in any way, but because other countries got worse. And I certainly don't wish a liberal and authoritarian policies on anyone, even if it means the UK goes down the ranking. I think, Chris, your report flagged up 5 liberalizations across the EU, which is staggeringly low. Italy did have a good one. They slashed tax on e-cigarette fluid, really positive. And that's something to watch in the UK, because the UK does continue to be the best overall in the EU for vaping, probably because politicians haven't gotten around to taxing it. But there have been some, there's been good noise on vaping in the UK so far. A lot of these campaign groups that are anti-smoking have recognized that it's a good way to get people off cigarettes. So that is a positive to take away. But that's the only area really where the UK has any kind of green light.
And vaping's quite bad elsewhere, Chris. Was it about 20 countries in your league table have some sort of kind of anti-vaping legislation, whether it's outdoor bans or fluid restrictions and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I would think at least. I can't remember the exact figures, but getting on for half the EU countries have a sin tax on vaping, and around about a half have an indoor ban, usually just replicating the smoking ban. So wherever you can't smoke is also where you can't vape, which is really not a very helpful policy at all. So yeah, it's not looking great on that front. And yes, it's true, and credit where credit's due, UK has actually done pretty well with that. In fact, it shows you how bad they are with alcohol, tobacco and food, that they're still finish up fourth despite being kind of 28th on e-cigarettes.
And let's talk a little bit about where things might be going, because there's been an interesting bit of news today about where the nanny state, particularly in Britain, might be going next. So the IPPR think tank has put out this proposal for sweets, snacks and sugary drinks to have plain packaging. It almost seems to be the kind of end result of what, people like you, Chris, have been warning about, that what happens to tobacco in particular is inevitably going to happen to all kinds of, far more benign, we might have thought, treats. Kate, what was your reaction to that story that came out today? We're recording on Wednesday. Did this all just feel a little bit inevitable, really, that this is where we might be headed?
I was still pretty shocked, but that's probably naivete on my part, because this is the direction everything's been going in. But to see a report that is essentially calling for the plain packaging of any kind of consumption that could possibly be deemed bad for you, and to have that, on the BBC homepage is really quite depressing, because, it isn't necessarily that these products are bad for you. They're bad for you if you're consuming them not within moderation, right? It's the idea that anything that could possibly be bad for you. And, how far do you take this? Are we going to start putting blankets over people's heads on first dates because, if they don't commit to you, they might break your heart? Like, lots and lots of things can be bad for you. That's the risk that any person takes to live a life, and to live a life that's meaningful. And the idea that adults can't choose what they're putting into their own bodies is maddening, especially when we're talking about a slice of cake. I think what also really infuriated me is that one of the quotes from the director of IPPR suggested that, this will make parents' lives easier because they won't have the pressure from their kids when they're walking down the aisles to grab the sweet things. Well, at the end of the day, if the state has to intervene because children are putting pressure on their parents, who isn't a victim? I mean, if parents can't stand up to their children, if we're saying even that is impossible and the state needs to intervene, we might as well call it a day. There's nothing then that adults can do that can exert any kind of control over their lives.
Chris, what was your thoughts on this IPPR stuff from today?
It's just the laziest kind of report that anybody could put out. It looks like it's cobbled together. It's full of spelling mistakes and typos and stuff. And the conclusions seem like they're just arrived at by a few people having a drink in the pub. It's, what have we done with tobacco? Let's do that with food and drink. And yeah, it is exactly what I've been warning about the whole time. And it's pretty depressing to see any think tank seriously propose it. The other annoying thing, from my point of view, as somebody who works for a think tank and does a lot of research in this area, is it's almost impossible for the IEA to get the BBC to cover anything we do. And a lot of what we do is pretty rigorously researched. I mean, take the Nanny State Index, for example. That takes months and months. It's got about 1,000 different data points in it, but the BBC never, ever go near it. But IPPR come up with some ludicrously liberal and Stalinist diktats, and it's on the front page of the BBC website. So, it shows you a bit about where the BBC's coming from with this as well. And the final point is that I don't think there's anything coincidental about the timing of this. The government's consultation on banning so-called junk food advertising on TV is in its last week. And alongside this IPPR report, something from Action on Sugar came out, which rather got overshadowed by the IPPR. Normally these people work together a bit more professionally in that. But they were saying that, Peppa Pig is being used to sell sweets to children. They found a chocolate bar or something with a cartoon character. This is shocking. Some of these products contain up to 99% sugar. Yeah, they're sweets. Of course they do. So what are you saying? That children shouldn't buy sweets? I mean, that seems to literally be the implication of both the IPPR's report and Action on Sugar stuff. And it's just ludicrous. I mean, is it not common sense? Are we so mad now that just to point out that it's okay for children to eat sweets, and in fact that is primarily who they're aimed at, and adults should drink and smoke and children should eat sweets, and there's nothing wrong with that system, let's keep it going. It's just bonkers beyond belief, and the effect it's having, I think, is probably intentional. Is one, you've got this consultation ongoing, and while the childhood obesity strategy is still being kind of worked through, and there's consultations for other aspects of it, all of which is really draconian stuff, actually, and would push the UK even further up the nanny state index, advertising ban, but also telling shopkeepers where they can position goods, banning the sale of energy drinks to kids, all kinds of things like that. And then the IPPR come along with this stuff that's even more extreme. It's a classic case of trying to move the Overton window. You try and make government policy look moderate by calling for something even more extreme. This is a classic trick that public health lobby have been using for a good 15 years. I remember well when smoking ban was originally proposed, like a few years before the smoking ban was proposed, and the Lancet came out saying we should ban cigarettes entirely. It had exactly the same effect. You move the Overton window, you move what's acceptable, policy conversations. And so, yeah, I suspect it's not a coincidence it's come out exactly this time. And of course it's eye-catching, and of course the media are going to love it.
Can I say a quick word about sort of moving the Overton window and what gets covered? Because to give a fair hearing to IPPR, their job on the left of policy is to push the boundaries, just as the IEA's job is to push free market boundaries. It is okay for us to come up with sort of the mecca in both directions for what we'd like to see, and then to, try to get some of that public policy implemented. I think the problem with this particular report is that they're advocating for sugar taxes and the rest, which increase the costs on people who are paid lowest. And also, particularly, there isn't much evidence. In fact, there's no evidence that sugar tax actually tackles obesity from the places it's been tried. So I think from an academic point, that's frustrating. But also from an IEA perspective, I mean, they're winning. What politician do you have standing up talking about how we need to roll back these nanny state measures? They can propose stuff like this because there isn't a party in government right now that disagrees with them. They might disagree with them on the fringes or think something's a bit too extreme, but this is the time for them to be pushing this stuff, because we don't have politicians standing up for the rights of people to do what they want. You can name a few politicians cross-party, thankfully, but their voices are not the loudest on this.
Hi, I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. So, Last Orders is free, as with all of Spike's other podcasts, all of our other content, and we really want to keep them free. If you'd like to help us out in that, all you have to do is just go to spiked-online.com, hit the donate button in the top right of the homepage, and give whatever you can. It's all really appreciated. Thanks so much. Now, back to the show. And while we're on the issue of party politics, I think this would be a good time to go into our second topic, which is a rather interesting one, which is Rory Stewart, who is a slightly unlikely Tory leadership candidate and recent kind of social media sensation, was in an interview with the Daily Telegraph last week, admitted that he had once smoked opium whilst at a wedding in Iran. He was later taken to task for this on Sky News. He apologised profusely for it, but it did start up this kind of interesting discussion on social media. Stephen Bush from New Statesman wrote an interesting piece basically making the point that no one would think it would be a proportionate response that having smoked opium, Rory Stewart should have been, sent to prison for 7 years on Class A drug offences and then damned to a life of low-paid work or crime. And yet it seems that even as we go into this new Tory leadership round, even as party politics feeling really in flux, the issue of kind of drugs policy the dial hasn't moved, it feels like, in any meaningful way. So, Chris, just your reaction to the Rory Stewart stuff, what you felt like it revealed about the state of the drugs debate today?
Well, it's not a very good advert for opium, is it? If that's what it turns you into. It's kind of wetty, wandering around parks, looking for people to talk to. So, I don't know. Let's not blame the opium. I assume he was always like that anyway. I agree that there is no one seriously talking about legalising opium, which I think is a shame, because I think of all the drugs to legalise, opium would be one of the better ones, because it's actually not particularly harmful. I know Rory Stewart can't say that. It's a much weaker drug than people assume. People obviously associate it with heroin and morphine, but that's because they're massively concentrated versions of the same drug. So, I would look forward to a world in which we get rid of the smoking ban and people can smoke opium indoors, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. And people like Stephen Bush come along and say, oh, there's hypocrisy here, and if it was some black kid in Brixton, he'd be banged up and all this kind of stuff. Well, yeah, maybe so. But I think, to be fair, in Iran, you can be sentenced to death for it. So, it wasn't like he was doing it somewhere where it's necessarily socially acceptable. So, no, I don't think it's a good advert for opium. I don't really like Rory Stewart. I suspect that the fact that it's associated with him makes it even less likely that it'll be legalised, but it's an extremely small possibility to start with.
Kate, any thoughts?
I thought Stephen Bush's comments nailed it. I mean, he's completely right. Nobody thinks that Rory Stewart should be going to prison for the fact that he took part in this, and yet every party's manifesto, well, not every party, but the major parties' manifestos are to lock people up and throw away the key if they were to do something like this. And I think what it does highlight, and where I do think we're gaining some traction, is on the issue of decriminalization. We may not be to legalization yet, but, should people lose their lives because of an action that potentially could harm themselves, but really nobody else? And the answer is obviously no. And Rory Stewart, is in a relatively privileged position where he's probably not going to be one of the ones who's locked up and the keys thrown away, but for many people they will be, and they don't have the resources to fight their corner. I'm optimistic on this. I don't think it's going to start with opioid, but I think that on the issue of marijuana, when you look at what's happening in the US and Canada, I think the UK will follow. I don't know how long that's going to take. It will certainly take a political party with the makeup that's willing to do it. But I don't see how the success stories coming out of the US and Canada can't trickle over to the UK.
I mean, it's interesting as well, because obviously at the last election, the Tories hadn't really moved at all. You did previously have Jeremy Corbyn making some quite positive noises about medicinal cannabis, but there was barely any mention of drugs at all in the Labour manifesto. So despite supposedly being this, radical party, didn't seem to want to really touch this issue. But, there are reasons to be cheerful. I mean, the Sun have come out more or less in favour of decriminalising cannabis. Opinion polls suggest that a lot of people are on board with it. Chris, is there a good chance that, maybe 5-10 years down the line, we will start to see something closer to what some US states have been experimenting with?
Yeah, it was a pretty good chance. But it would take other European countries to do it first. We're just not. I can't see us being the first one to do it yet.
You don't think Brexit Britain, with its newfound sovereignty, would
no
get high all the time?
Take part in this benevolent act of getting people out of prison?
Well, it depends who's in charge. I mean, it's not. It does. It's not inconceivable, is it? But
I think you're totally right. A politician who's got the confidence to make these arguments, I think, will win the day. I think people are ready. I think, as you say, opinion polls show that most people are ready for decriminalization anyway. And you need someone to say it. But I think if they came along, I think they see positive results.
And Chris, is it the case that things are going to get? I mean, surely everyone realises the kind of social cost of this. There's every couple of months there'll be another scare story about how skunk is destroying young people's brains, etc. Why is it that it just never really makes it through to being a top-line issue? Is it just because we've got so much else to talk about right now, and so everything is naturally shelved, and occasionally we remember it when Rory Stewart tells a story? Or is it, is there something else going on? Are they just terrified to touch
I think they probably think there's more votes to be lost than there are to be gained from it, I think. And also, there's actually not that many people smoke cannabis. If the statistics are anything like believable, and obviously you're going to get a lot of underreporting, but the absolute numbers of people consuming it are actually pretty low, and have got a lot lower over the years. And a lot of those people are not really, not the most politically active people in the country, to put it mildly, right? And so they haven't got much of a campaign going for them. Groups like Vault Fast and Transform have been doing a good job, and the whole Billy Caldwell case really changed opinion. I mean, I think that the surveys went from being kind of 1/3 of the population in favour of legalising to being 2-1 in favour of legalising. So that particular case, although the kid still can't actually get his cannabis, unfortunately, so it hasn't actually changed anything for that family, that did seem to make a big difference. And if we can get this message through about harm reduction, try and make people understand that the skunk is a product of prohibition, then I think we can win it. But I don't think that message is really getting through.
And aside from the question of just cannabis at the moment, because we were talking earlier about moving the Overton window a little bit, I mean, if we were to be a lot more radical about this, Kate, what could a Britain in which we took a far more liberal approach to not just cannabis but all drugs look like? Because it feels like people can't even imagine what that would possibly be like, where all these things would be far more regulated and therefore available? But
I think it's hard because there are some major upsides, right? If you took the step past decriminalization, which would be a huge liberalization in its own right, and then went to legalization, there's very little evidence that consumption rates go up over any long period of time once things become legalized. People don't just start shooting up heroin because it's available. And so, I think you would see that, things would remain roughly the same in terms of consumption with much safer products, easier access to healthcare, easier access to mental health because it'd be easier to reach out to people who are potentially suffering from addiction. But what no one's really been able to crack, and I think this is an issue for libertarians, is how do you start having the conversation about date rape drugs? Should every drug be legalized? That becomes, I don't have answers to that. I think that makes me feel nervous to think that everything under the sun could be quite easily accessed. Now, granted, there would be databases of people purchasing things in somewhere like Boots, but that's, are libertarians comfortable with that? So there are still questions that we have to answer. I think the first step is decriminalization because there's no harm that can come from that. Get people out of prison, get people out of courtrooms that are taking up money and resources for something that they've only decided to do to themselves. And again, it makes it easier to reach out to people, as Chris says, from the harm reduction point about getting access to physical and mental health care if they need it, if they're suffering from addiction.
But I have to disagree with you about decriminalisation because, firstly, it wouldn't actually get people out of prison. As Peter Hitchens quite rightly says, there's almost nobody in prison for consuming or possessing cannabis. They're all dealers, and the dealers would still be illegal under decriminalisation, right? You're only decriminalising possession. And secondly, it doesn't give the government any tax money to go for. And the only reason the politicians are going to go for this in the end is because they see all these states in America making a huge amount of tax revenue. So I think legalization of cannabis is the way forward.
I think legalization of cannabis is the way forward.
Like immediately, without the stepping stone of decriminalization.
Well, I think
it's quite doable. I mean, the American states haven't decriminalized and then legalized. It's gone full legalization.
I think if you decriminalize not only those who consume drugs, but also those who are dealing in small quantities, that would have an impact. You're completely right that the incentive for politicians is lower. But again, I think any politician from that human perspective making the case would actually have a lot of sympathy.
We need to get a sense of perspective about all this. I mean, cannabis there's a reasonable probability of being legalised.
Yeah.
There's no point even talking about the rest of them. I mean, 10 minutes ago we were talking about how sugar and sweets are being treated like tobacco. This is not the trajectory we're on, are we, towards like legalising heroin.
Right, before we get into the final section of the podcast, I just want to tell you about one way you can support the show. You can support Spiked that will cost you nothing and take about 30 seconds of your time. If you could just make sure that you, first of all, subscribe to this podcast, get it straight to your device every month. But also, if you've got a second on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, just leave us a rating and a review. It's all really appreciated and it helps us reach new people. Now, on to the last section. To move on to our final topic, let's talk about someone who was probably a quite important part of getting the nanny state to the extent that we're talking about plain packaging for sweets. So celebrity chef, nanny state campaigner, professional Mockney Jamie Oliver has been through a bit of a bad patch at the moment financially. He recently had to close 22 of his 25 restaurants.
Chris, stop smiling.
Ear to ear at the moment over there. But his business has been put into administration. Of course, this is a tragedy for all of those who have lost their jobs, but it does give us a bit of a moment to reflect on the man behind the chain and the role that he has taken in recent years, over the past decade or more, for his various books, his TV shows, his crusade against school meals, going around calling working class parents arseholes and tossers for feeding their kids fizzy drinks. He really felt to be the kind of sharp end of the sort of nanny state paternalism. So, Chris, what are your thoughts as someone who's been a long-time critic of Mr. Oliver, to put it lightly?
I'm very, very sad about the whole thing. It's very traumatic. I cried myself to sleep that night when I found out. It's wonderful, wonderful news. Thanks for reminding me about it, actually. It's great. And I know you have to pay lip service to all the people who lost their jobs, and it is obviously a shame they've lost their jobs. But I don't feel sorry for all of them. There's bound to be at least some of them who are really happy to be working for Jamie Oliver. So I'm not sorry for those people. But the rest of them, I'm sure they'll find a job very easily, and it will almost inevitably be with somebody better. So I mean, the obituaries of his restaurant chain have been written, and people have put it down to various different things. Clearly, the food was a big issue. I obviously never went to his restaurants
on principle.
I wouldn't give him a bent penny, but a lot of people who did said it was overpriced. muck, really. It was fairly basic Italian food that wasn't even cooked properly, and it was too expensive. So obviously that is going to play a major part in a restaurant going down. I still do, however, want to believe that a lot of it is down to the fact that Jamie Oliver's pissed off so many people over the years that you've alienated massive sections of society. So, I mean, Turkey Twizzlers was trending on Twitter the day that this company went into administration. And there were hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people of the kind of millennial generation saying this is one of the best days of my life. I never forgive him for that Turkey Twizzlers episode. And so they were happy. So presumably those people would never darken his doorstep. And then he annoys people like me because of all the nanny state stuff. He annoys anyone who likes Ribena and Lucozade because they blame him all for the sugar tax. He gets blamed actually for stuff that isn't even his fault. You know, when Nicola Sturgeon was trying to ban 2-for-1 pizzas, Jamie Oliver got blamed for it. And I don't think that was specifically his idea, but it clearly is the kind of thing he'd do, right? So as soon as you hear about some stupid bit of food fascism, you immediately think this Jamie Oliver has got his fingerprints over this. So I like to think that in part it's people boycotting him because of his horrendous nanny state politics, but it's difficult to prove that. And of course it might just be that the food was rank. But I'm delighted that his business has failed. It's a shame that all the suppliers will be given probably a penny in the pound while he sits on his massive bank account of something like £200 million. He's just bought himself a new stately home. I mean, he's not got his comeuppance as much as I would like him to, but hopefully he has further to fall. Hopefully he'll lose his TV programs. That would be the next thing. Because speaking of people he's pissed off, Channel 4 now hate him because he's been instrumental in this advertising ban. So he's on TV at 8 o'clock cooking all this food that is high in fat, sugar and salt. But soon the companies who sell this stuff to normal people won't be able to advertise in the slots. And Channel 4 are losing, or going to lose at least tens of millions of pounds a year. So they're not very happy with him. So hopefully they'll take it out on him and he won't be on TV anymore. He won't have any restaurants. All he'll have is his cookbooks. And how many more recipes can he possibly have in him anyway? So hopefully he's been cancelled.
We shall see. Kate, any thoughts on all of this?
Wow. I will pay lip service to those who lost their jobs. I think it's difficult, right, in the age of British Steel that some people's jobs are so hugely protected by the state, by interference, and other people, have to live life in a much less protected way. I mean, that is the market, right? Businesses have to succeed and fail, and that's the reality. But for these people who have lost their jobs in Jamie Oliver's restaurant, not only are their jobs not protected, but when they come out, their living costs will be higher thanks to their former boss. And Chris is completely right on this point of hypocrisy, and it's what really gets me about Jamie Oliver is that he was happy to make his absolute fortune from people buying butter and salt to put into their fatty foods that he recommended. But he's not happy when other people do it, and he's not happy when other people do it cheaper, so it's more accessible to people who don't earn as much. And I think, I never bought into his ideology around food or drink, but it was when he came out and said, oh yeah, I'd let my kids eat McDonald's. I'd let my children eat McDonald's. I just don't want your children to eat McDonald's. And I want that to, I can afford if they double their prices, but you probably should be priced out. That I just thought, the hypocrisy there runs so deep. And I believe we've invited him to debate Chris from time to time, and he's never taken us up on the offer. And I think that if you hold...
Still here, Jamie, if you're interested.
I think if you hold views like that, you have to be held accountable. And I wish more people did hold him accountable. He often does get a platform. I appreciate he's famous. He did build an empire. He's losing it now. There are reasons to give him a platform, but he needed to be on that platform with someone with a different perspective. That's very rarely happened. He's had a huge amount of influence. That influence has hurt people on lower incomes. And I don't think there's any getting around that reality.
Who actually likes Jamie Oliver? When it comes down to it, have you ever met anyone who actually likes him?
Some of my friends do have his cookbooks.
Very rarely. Yeah, I know that people
like his cookbooks.
There are people who have cookbooks, don't like him. Fair enough, if you just like his recipes. But I'm not saying I've never met anyone who likes him, but it's very, very rare. I think he's one of these people that people who work in the media think is popular, but actually he has very little support amongst the general public. James Corden's another one. You like these people who have careers that cannot be explained rationally other than a bunch of idiots in the media just think, oh, this guy's really popular.
But isn't this celebrity culture now? I mean, there's so many celebrities who I just adore and love to watch, but I cannot stand to listen to them talk about politics. Partially because I disagree with what they're saying, but what they're saying is never backed up by fact because they're celebrities. They don't think they have to argue their position, so they just make outrageous, bold claims and they make lots of rude political statements, usually about right-wingers. And, you know, I love to watch their movies and I love to tune into the TV shows, but I can't stand what they have to say. I think Jamie Oliver might fit into that category.
And did you see what Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall's up to yesterday? Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, who jumped on this Jamie Oliver obesity thing like 10 years after Jamie Oliver had started doing it, clearly just a poor man's Jamie Oliver, which is about as damning a description of anyone you can think of. He's now getting on the war on plastic. He's made a documentary that's literally called War on Plastic, and he's jumped on that bandwagon. It's such a shameless, transparent attempt to keep himself in the spotlight. Does he have any restaurants? All his restaurants gone bust as well.
I've got no idea.
Wouldn't surprise me.
But that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, the Jamie Oliver thing is interesting as well because there was a time in which he was still a bit of a kind of media and political darling, but it feels like very recently he's just completely fallen out of favour. But his message was always the same. You know, he's kind of got this rep now as being pushing it a little bit too far. He's just, you know, really nasty. This kind of sense of just being so incessantly patronising that even that's a little bit much. But, you know, people were lauding him as brilliant when he accused those mothers in Rotherham of being fat old scrubbers for handing, you know, takeaway food through the gates for the reason that it turned out because the school had gone through this big overhaul because of school dinners, because of Jamie's school dinners, and had this big food shortage as a result. But nevertheless, you know, at the time, he was still being lauded as some sort of, you know, great progressive
by
voice.
By some people, I suppose. Obviously, not by me. I remember when he very first came on the scene like 20 years ago, he was a face of Sainsbury's. And my understanding is that they actually pulled that campaign in the north of England way before they were supposed to, because it just turned people off Sainsbury's, because people in North England just didn't like his mockney sort of patter. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, it could be apocryphal. I remember hearing it at the time, though, that Sainsbury's were not too keen to use him up in the north anyway, because people just thought, who's this Cockney dickhead kind of thing. So there's always been lots of good reasons to dislike him. I never liked him even then with that, when he was sort of like a wet lad, wasn't he? Do you remember? That was his part. He had his little moped and he had and he was advertising bacon sandwiches. You can't see this advert on YouTube anymore, but it did used to be on. He sort of wakes up in the morning with a hangover because he's a bit of a lad, and Jules is in the bed with him, and she gets up to make the breakfast. Yeah, get the bird, make the breakfast. And you go, none of that low-fat malarkey. You can't make it up, can you? I mean,
that's a journey right there. I don't want to defend Jamie Oliver, but Chris has really made the case again. So I guess what I would say is, you know, we seem to be increasingly living in an age where how we feel sort of translates to a truth, which just isn't how it should be. You should have to back up what you say with evidence. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to feel a way that isn't backed up by the facts, but you should still have to acknowledge these things. I suspect Jamie Oliver is someone who made a heck of a ton of money and thought to himself, I'm going to give back now. How am I going to do it? And he saw some unhealthy kids and he thought, that's what I want to target. I think it is such a shame that he didn't look at the evidence. And you know, childhood obesity is a reality. It's something that we all need to talk about. We probably need to get kids moving more. That's almost certainly going to be a major part of the solution. But if he wanted to meaningfully do that, I'd have a lot more time for him. Every policy he's come up with just hasn't proved successful, whether it's been tried around the world or been tried here in the UK. I mean, he hasn't been very successful at what he wanted to stop or what he wanted to change. So that's a bit sad, really. I think there are a lot of people out there who have good intentions. If you're not willing to look at the evidence, you're not going to get very far.
I don't even think he had good intentions, really. Okay. I think he just saw this as as being a vehicle for fame. It's a very competitive market, the TV chef market, and you need to have a gimmick. Like Heston Blumenthal, he uses a blowtorch, and Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall slaughters his own pigs. They've all got a little USP. And Jamie Oliver was, you know, I'm a sort of political campaigner. I'm a school dinner campaign. That was his thing. And it's kept him in the news very, very successfully for a long time. And he gets invited to go along to the select committee talking bollocks about fizzy drinks and stuff like this. Go, we'll have the teaspoons on the
I think there's a Quentin Tarantino film in celebrity TV show chefs. I think there's like some kind of action film there in this very competitive market.
Yeah, I don't like it. Gordon Ramsay swears. The Galloping Gourmet galloped. Delia, what did Delia do? Delia didn't need one. Delia just did good recipes.
She was just excellent.
Yeah.
Bring Delia back.
Delia's the only one of those people I like.
She used butter.
And she gets drunk at the football and starts screaming as well, doesn't she? That's much more like it.
Just finally, though, Chris, is the problem that kind of everyone's Jamie Oliver now, insofar as, we are in a world where we're talking about plain packaging for crisps? I mean, he has kind of become really out of fashion and people think he's really patronising. People will rinse him on Twitter at the drop of a hat. But at the same time, we are in a position where some of these policies even he might have thought crazy a few years ago look like they might be coming to pass.
Yeah, that's probably true. I just want them to bring back turkey Twizzlers. Because I never got to try them. We didn't have turkey Twizzlers at my school. But they must have been sensational. When you see how angry people are, like 15 years later, they're still going on Twitter about it all the time. Any day or night, type in turkey Twizzlers into Twitter, you will see people go, I miss turkey Twizzlers so much, I hate Jamie Oliver. They must have been like the most delicious things ever invented. Somebody bring them back. Food industry, if you're listening, bring back turkey Twizzlers.
I think that's a perfect place to end it. Chris, Kate, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to get it direct onto your device every month. And if you'd like to support the show and support all the work that Spiked does, please do consider giving us a donation. All you have to do is go to spiked-online.com, hit the donate button in the top right of the homepage, and give whatever you can. Thanks so much. See you next time.